So I'm here today to talk about starting your Spice and Life blanket, working these first few rows, the treble rows. So the first row of the pattern is worked in yarn B. I've made up my colour card here, which is from the paid for pattern, and yarn B is Papaya Punch for the original pack. If you're using a different pack or different colours, then you can use whichever colour applies for you. So when you're working a pattern, it's always a good idea to work up a swatch first, especially when you're using a yarn that's different from the one listed in the pattern. That will give you a good idea of the fabric you're going to get, what kind of gauge you're working to, and how much yardage you'll need for the yarn you're using. For more information about swatches, you can see my blog posts about the Spice of Life blanket. They're all linked from my Spice of Life page, and I'll put the link to that page, which has all the information on it, below this video. So I'm going to make a small piece, like a swatch, that we can use as a sample for these videos. So I'm just making a slip stitch to start and some chains. So I have a few chains here, so I can begin working into those by making treble stitches or US double stitches. So I skip the first 3 chains and then I work into the 4th chain. If you'd like help on working any of the stitches in the pattern, I have links for those in the paid for pattern, or if you just visit my blog, I have a crochet site and that has more details on the stitches. So there's the first 3 stitches that I've made, and the 3 chains that we skipped at the beginning, that counts as your first stitch. So when we're working back along the row, we'll also need to make sure we work into those last 3 chains to make the last stitch. So here I've actually got 4 stitches, so the chains that counts as 1, 2, 3 and then 4. So continue working your trebles along to the end of your row. So I'm almost there with my stitches. If you're having any trouble working into this first chain, if you haven't been crocheting for long, or if you're a beginner, just check out my either the paid for pattern or my blog posts, my Spice of Life blog post, and I've got some tips in there for how to work into that first chain. So there I've finished my first row of stitches. It can be a good idea at this stage just to double check you've got the right number, because it's quite easy to lose stitches, especially when you're starting out, or even gain them. So it's always a good idea to just keep checking back on the correct number of stitches as you work through the pattern. But if you start off right, that's always a step in the right direction. So to work another row, the turning chain for a treble or a US double is 3 chains, so I always do 3 chains. Those 3 chains will count as my first stitch. So that's the first stitch of the row below and the first stitch of this second row. So my second stitch is made into the second stitch of the row below. Some people prefer to work differently to that, and that's absolutely fine, but that's how the pattern's written for this one. So that's how I generally work. And then I'll carry on just making stitches all the way across this row. And this is what in the pattern is referred to as a treble row or a US double row, and we'll keep coming back to that, and we'll be working rows of these treble stitches at different points in the pattern. So now I've done a stitch into each of the stitches in the row below, and now I just have to work into that last stitch, which is the turning chain that we created at the beginning of the last row. So you just need to see that top chain, which is just there, and I'm just going to work into that. So I'm just going to hook the back loop on there. there we are, I've got the 2 loops of the chain on the top, I've got the bottom loop of the chain on the bottom, and I can just work my last stitch in place. So that's how you want to keep a nice even stitch count. So always count the first chain as your first stitch. The next stitch will be made into the second stitch, unless the pattern directs you otherwise, which occasionally it will. And then you want to make sure that you're working into that starting chain stitch at the end of the rows. So now you can carry on working colours as per the pattern. So next we have yarn C, which for me is a nice soft pink colour. So I've turned the work over and I've just got that yarn laying across the top there. This is how I do it for treble rows or US double rows. So I just hold the yarn and pull it through. I just grab the yarn end, just put that to that side, I hold it in place, and I just do my first chains. Then those are the 2 yarn strands are just hanging down there. Now as this is a treble row and the yarn strands will be hidden in the work, I'm just going to stitch over them for a few stitches to hold them in place. So they're tucked in between the stitches just to secure them for a little bit. And I'll now move those to the back. I'll carry on working my stitches. So then you can see they're hanging out, and when I get to the end of this colour I'll go back and I'll weave those ends in. If I was going to skip stitches straight away, obviously I wouldn't pull the yarns across the top, I would just leave them hanging at the back and then weave them in later. But when it's a treble row like this and I can hide the yarns under the stitches for a little way, I just like to do that. So here's my finished section of the treble rows or US double rows. I've completed all of the ones for the starting of the blanket. And as you can see, it's all looking quite even. I've got some quite nice straight edges, nothing is bending in or going out, so that's fine. So I'm quite happy to continue with that. If you do have any problems with it coming out at the top, it usually happens when your tension changes. So if you, particularly when you're starting out, you tend to sort of hold on to everything very tightly and be quite tense while you're making it. So these sort of stitches can be quite tight and tense, and then as you start to get into it and relax, your motions become a little bit more fluid, you're moving a bit easier, you're not holding everything so tightly, and things can tend to grow. So if you're having a particular problem with that, you can either, depending on how much it bothers you, you can either block it out later if it's only happening a little bit, or if it's really bothering you, you'll want to go back and kind of work these first few rows again, or maybe even use a bigger hook for the bottom there. So that's something you can do to combat that problem.